If I could offer you only one tip for the future, sunscreen would be it. The long-term benefits of sunscreen have been proved by scientists, whereas the rest of my advice has no basis more reliable than my own meandering experience. I will dispense this advice now. Baz Luhrmann, everybody's free to wear sunscreen. The Daily Grind, Chapter 193. Good evening, everyone. James once again stood on a stage at the back of what was, basically, a converted warehouse space. Though this time there'd been some more time to plan and some more effort put into setting up the seating in a way that was useful. They also had cameras this time, too. Actual studio-quality cameras being used to record for the historical record and to stream the meeting to anyone who didn't want to be in a crowded room today. The room was also less crowded than last time. The lack of a potential lethal conflict, and of any sort of pressing emergency, reduced turnout somewhat, possibly because there were just fewer people in the building. A lot of the newer members of the Order actually did have homes and families, and even a portion of the Camercondas had started to find places to be outside of this one structure, which was nice. James appreciated it, and there were just some people with jobs to do, which James also appreciated. There were a bunch of people in Taunton, too. There was still more work to be done there. The possessions of the survivors had long since been recovered and returned, but there was a lot of city to look over. Inhuman constructions had a habit of catching fire if left unmaintained for too long. Cleanup of the damage would take more than just a few people, but the people down there were making a start, where the Order could expand into when they were ready to start putting their magic to the test. The end result was that the 50 or so people who had arrived to take part as the audience for this discussion got much more comfortable chairs, and this time the pipeline of suggestions had been streamlined. Instead of spending half their meeting time checking their laptops or phones, the representatives on the stage were making full use of the Order's population of interns to filter and pass on relevant information and immediately useful ideas and questions from the audience. Hopefully it would work out. They hadn't tried it yet, but James was optimistic. He had no idea what this would look like on a larger scale, or after it had been refined over multiple iterations, but for them, right now, this was a good way to keep everyone involved. The crowd today was different, James realized. Not just different in composition, though he did notice at least one or two of the potion people were here, and he could have sworn he'd seen Kiko lurking around somewhere, the rat roach staying separate from everyone else, even as he was in a crowded room. But more than that, it was different faces. Humans and Camercondas that he didn't know, hadn't met. Oh, he recognized them. He knew that several of these were people who had joined Response or Recovery under the general umbrella of a job. He knew some of the Camercondas were the ones who took a long time to break out of their fear and aversion to people, or they were new ones that they'd been stealing away from the office over time. But it didn't change the fact that mixed in with all the people like Morgan and Alex who he'd talked to, worked with, fought alongside, and considered friends, there were a lot of new faces, and they were all looking at him. He felt a smile flicker over his face. This could be something that sparked anxiety, but instead, James decided he was pretty happy with how the Order was going. New people was exactly what they wanted, and public speaking was somehow the one thing that had never scared him. All right, for anyone new or who needs a refresher, the four of us... He turned and looked at the people on stage, double-checking his counting. The 7 of us are going to be discussing our strategy for the next few months. If anyone in the audience has a question or a comment, put it in the relevant part of our chat server. We'll address it when appropriate or at the end. Or, if you don't have a phone or laptop on you, signal one of the interns and they'll come get it from you. He motioned to their small group of volunteers, one of whom waved cheerfully around the room. James couldn't help but give a full smile at the enthusiasm. All right, good. We got a few things on the agenda for today, so let's get started, and then everyone can go run free, unshackled from the need to think or talk about our problems before we make poor choices on how to solve them. You were absolutely not supposed to say that part out loud, Sarah told him as he settled into the chair next to her. Hush, James said, grin still in place, looking around at the others on stage. Sarah was here, obviously. She wasn't representing a particular division of the Order. Instead, she was simply one of the people who a lot of people had asked to be here. Functionally, she was filling the literal role of a representative. On the other side of her from James, Texture of Bark Dust sat as the primary representative for recovery. The Camerconda coiled in the basket seat in such a way as so her brain could be wired into the laptop in front of her comfortably for maximum efficiency. Past her was Marcus for response. The young man, who had originally just been recruited to be a dispatch operator, had stuck around and gotten good recognition from a lot of people for his calm spirit. Now he was here as something like one of Harvey's lieutenants. Marcus was also a good example of one of their non-combatants. He had no interest in fighting or dungeon delving. He wanted to work where he'd be useful now, and James respected the hell out of that. And so did a lot of other people. James also respected the constantly growing tableau of pride flag pins on Marcus's jacket. It was comforting. Next was Reed, making a rare appearance from the research basement, though that was a little uncharitable. Reed actually spent a lot of time all over the place. The Order had a few empty lots in the middle of nowhere now where they tested orange orbs, or, apparently, space elevators, and Reed did a lot of work on both of those. He also did work looking into statistical modeling of dungeon effects, identifying magic items, generally keeping an eye on and leading the rest of the research department, small things like that. Reed was currently surrounded by Planner, the infomorph being the other non-human person on stage, an octet of tentacled limbs with a ghostly green surface that somehow still seemed rubbery, markings like sketched notes trailing down them. Planner was here to provide legal and logistical insight, and also the unique position of the infomorph side of living that any of their long-term plans might impact. And JP, for the first time at one of these meetings in his actual role as the head of their rogue division. James still did consider JP his friend, even if the two of them hadn't had a chance to hang out in what felt like forever. First things first, JP started them off. The alchemists. Yes, Reed nodded. What are we doing with the potions? No, dude, that's not... JP gave Reed a sideways look before giving a small shake of his head. We need to talk about what we're doing with the surviving members. James cut in. James was here for a lot of reasons. One of them was to sort of guide the meeting, but the other was to make sure that stuff stayed aligned with their long-term ethical goals. And JP had given him a perfect opportunity to do that. We've been over this, he told JP. There aren't foolproof options, but this is an actual chance to put some ideas into action. I can think of one foolproof option, JP opined. Man, don't do that. James' mirth was gone now, replaced by a quiet sadness. The threat they represented is gone. They get a chance to be something else. Therapy, community service, community integration. These are the things that we are leaning on. We're not fucking killing them. People deserve second chances, Texture of Bark Dust added with a hard note in her digital voice. JP practically glared across the table at James. We've done this before, he said. We absolutely have not, Sarah rebutted adamantly. We let people go before. This time we're kind of just a big community prison, but a different one than society at large. She glanced at James. Is that right? Am I getting that right? Is society a prison? As your lawyer, I advise you not to answer that, Planner said. And everyone paused and turned to the manifested infomorph. Had that been a joke? That was new. James shook it off. The point is, we are keeping an eye on them, because they are dangerous, yes, just like half the people in this room, and the vast majority of people on this stage. But, the goal is to build a system where restorative justice is the default and not an accident. That means we actually need to try things. Now is an opportunity to do that. James said it with a shrug, noticing an intern passing Sarah a message next to him. If it's a deciding factor, a lot of people, including the potions, would prefer James's thing over the spontaneous execution, Sarah said. Also, hey, stop being such an asshole. We're going right into being unprofessional today, but how have you been friends with us for this long and still think it's okay to kill people? JP opened his mouth like he was about to say something, and then realized halfway through that for the first time he didn't actually have a comeback to that. No snappy one-liner or retort. He was just angry, and he wasn't quite sure why. Part of him wanted to chalk it up to some kind of outside infomorph influence, but that would be too easy, and it didn't take him more than a heartbeat to realize he was just making an excuse to himself. Sarah, out of everyone in this room, had just called him an asshole. That was not a good sign, and JP knew it. So he took a deep breath through his nose, and instead of what he was going to say, just said, "You know what? You're right. Sorry." The look on James's face more or less made up for him having to exercise humility. "So, potions?" Reed chimed in again. "Because, boy, do we have some potions." "I actually have a question about that," Marcus said, looking down at the notebook he'd brought along. So the muscle regeneration one is the one that works for exercise, right?" "Right," Reed confirmed. "But not external source injuries. Do not ask me how it knows." Marcus nodded, having long since gotten used to accepting statements like that at face value. "Sure, right. Well, it would be really helpful for response, but we're worried about integrating it into our long-term training program, or any operation, really, just because it seems like it's really finite. Can you actually make more?" A pained look crossed Reed's face, like he had just been told that he would have to return his Christmas gifts. I mean, we were going to... It was... He grimaced and then sighed. "Yeah, we can make more," he admitted. "The formula's easy. It seems like it's optimized for volume, kind of." "Don't do that thing," Texture of Barkdust chided him, swiveling to face Marcus. "The exercise potions are useful, but they are among the lowest known value conversions of the liquid of information. Do not rely on a steady supply." "Got it." Marcus made a check mark on his book, and then squinted and looked back up at the camera conda at about the same time as a muffled series of laughs went across the audience. "Sorry, hang on. The what?" "The liquid of... the sap of the Tree of Knowledge," Reed dove in. "And yeah, she's right, which is actually what I wanted to get confirmation on and sort of direct some funding and focus toward. The tree grows about a fruit a day. The sizes vary a little bit. I've got a lot of requests on different things to try. If we're not interested in making this our business, we get a lot of room to experiment, and if we can devote more time to finding patterns, we can take more targeted shots on effects we need." He cleared his throat and rubbed at the back of his head, the unrestrained poof of curly hair on top bobbing as he did so. "Also, we have a lot of weird stuff around here that people want to turn into potions." "Yeah, I bet we..." "Yes, intern Brian?" James said, his attention catching on the kid who was taking incoming messages from the audience. The lanky student, having gotten his attention, pushed a button in time with James getting a message on his phone, which appeared to be a link to a spreadsheet. He looked over it for about 5 seconds before looking back up at Reed. "Alright, yeah, I think about half the people sitting here watching us have already submitted ideas." "Great, cool." Reed rubbed at his forehead. "We should have done this in secret," he muttered. "Ha! No," Sarah replied. James shook his head and got them back on track. "Okay, Reed, what do you need?" "Funding for a few supplies, and lab animals. Alternatively, if someone could make us a Dungeon Tech cup that would tell you if a liquid in it would kill you, that would be nice. I don't really want to use animal testing, but I really, really don't want to use person testing, and a lot of the recorded potion tests the alchemist did were not good for whatever drank them." "Who did they test potions on?" JP asked, the cold anger sparking again in his chest, because he already knew the answer. "Oh, also kind of lab rats," Reed said. Mostly. Sometimes random people. We can talk about that later if you really want to know." "Okay," James said. "If there's no objections, preliminary vote now. All in favor of going ahead with consistent potion experimentation? Everybody at the table raised their hands, or, in Texture of Bark Dust's case, a green circle of cardboard stapled to a stick. The blender hummed as it ran for 3 minutes on the puree setting. The fruit from the tree, no one was going to call it by the official name, especially not when they didn't have another The Tree to reference, was reduced by efficient mechanical action into a golden slurry. So far, it didn't appear to make any difference whether the rind of the fruit was included, which was itself notable, because literally every other ingredient did matter, and that included ambient dust. They ran their tests now in a clean room, in hazmat suits, but the chunks of non-liquid material from the fruit were entirely neutral in potion formula, which was bizarre. It did make it a lot easier to process them, though. No need to use an eyedropper to get every last spot of fluid when you could simply turn it all into a consistent mass. The blender clicked off. The material inside was carefully moved into individual treated containers to minimize loss. One of them was handed off, and then taken to be added to the current experiment. A heating element brought a beaker of expired whole milk to just under a boil. A sterilized mechanical grinder powdered a plastic straw. Half a dropper of Camerconda venom was dosed out, and exactly 1 standard teaspoon was measured of table salt. Early on, someone had suggested using a cauldron. For aesthetics, and as a joke. As it turned out, while most of the equipment used didn't actually matter, what the ultimate final product was brewed in did, somehow, and so the cauldron sat on the shelf in the clean room along with a few other options. This time, the option was a stainless steel soup pot. Milk and sap first, stir by hand, add salt, stir until it begins to thicken, add venom, cease stirring, dust the top with straw powder, let cool to 90 degrees Fahrenheit before stirring again, stir until liquid is consistent in texture and it starts to thin. Anyone could stir the potion, or go through the mechanical actions. Early on, they had thought that the species of the maker mattered, but as with everything, it turned out that any ingredient, including trace amounts of saliva or hair, could change the nature of a potion. Whether a potion actually worked on a given species was differentiated. This one worked on both humans and Camercondas equally. And, after all that work, they had 8 doses of this. The substance still needed to be strained before going into vials, or it would cause short-term nerve damage to the digits. It would cause itching, anyway. But aside from that, it was perfectly safe. They even knew the effects. But every batch, especially when the recipes were being tweaked slightly to try to refine them, always got one of its dose tested first on lab rats before moving on to sophent trials. This potion would make it so, for the next 2 hours, any living, growing plants the drinker made contact with would grow at a vastly accelerated rate. They had been absurdly lucky to figure that one out from one of their volunteers, who also just happened to work in the gardens. For at least 4 potions, they knew that they were safe to drink, but not why anyone would want to. They may as well have just had bad-tasting, overpriced health drinks without the information on what they did, or the health part of it. This version was a modification, so they needed to make sure it was safe first, but if it still worked, whether it got stronger or weaker would be another data point on the ongoing search for the truth in the patterns of reality, as reality applied to the sap from the Tree of Knowledge. Done, Alchemist Red said, stepping back from the table holding the rack of vials. Are you through yet? She asked Davis in a curt but not unfriendly tone. Davis didn't glance up from where he was monitoring the temperature on the distillation process for his own work. No, he said, desperately wishing he had a way to itch his scalp through the hazmat suit. The alchemists had, among other things, potions that encouraged hair growth, and as the Order didn't really have any plans to sell them to the alchemist's old customers, he had commandeered a dose for himself. As a punishment for the previously balding man's vanity, his head itched, and he was trying to ignore it by staring at a thermometer. It ticked up by 1 degree, and he hit a button on the heating element, allowing it to start cooling. Okay, yes. Inside, a potion that would probably dissolve the kidneys of anything that drank it sat. They would not be ever coming close to testing that on humans. Probably. It might not, but it did seem like even small steps away from known recipes could make them shockingly dangerous. They needed to know anyway, though. Outside of the clean room, the two of them pulled off their suits and set them aside to be attended to later. Alchemist Red wore clothing that was butting up against formal wear underneath hers, while Davis simply wore a thin white shirt and shorts. He knew he was getting older, knew his body wasn't what it used to be, but life with the Order had taught him two things. That the casual shame in how he looked was a poison he needed to purge from his system, and also that his body was what he made of it. Literally. A combination of exercise potions, purple orbs, and being one of the people who was high on the list to get an Akashic Sewer textbook had left him in the best shape of his life. He'd played football in high school, and he was pretty sure that himself now could wipe the floor with himself at what had felt like his peak. "Good work today," he said to Red as they made their way toward the storage racks for completed but untested potions. The woman replied. She wasn't, Davis had learned, mean exactly. She was just acutely aware of the fact that she was, truly, a prisoner. But she had a passion, wanted to be doing this work, wanted to be expanding their knowledge, and so the Order made that happen. Her name was Amelia. She hated being called that, so Davis just called her Red. It was still hard not to append alchemist at the start of her name whenever he thought it, but technically she wasn't an alchemist anymore. She was just... What was she? Floundering, he knew that much. He'd been in a similar boat, when he'd been dragged out of hell and given help without any question of repayment. Though Davis supposed he hadn't actually killed anyone, Red had. By accident, by omission, or by direct action, he didn't really know, and he didn't need to know. That was between her and her therapist. What he knew about her now was that she had ideas about their work. She had a laundry list of experiments she wanted to run. She spent her time reading and rereading the papers and reports that they wrote, checking the numbers, monitoring the lab rats and striders. And she didn't use short sentences and clipped language because she hated anyone. If anything, out of all the alchemists that Davis had met, and he had met all three of the survivors, she was the least likely to ever be a problem again. All she had ever wanted to do was cure cancer and make people smarter and be praised for it, and now she'd been told she could do exactly that as long as she played nice. How do you render a criminal harmless? Give them what they always wanted. Just do it in a less harmful way. Davis had almost laughed about that. If you had told the older version of him, the guy that had voted Republican a decade ago, that he'd end up thinking that prisons were obsolete, he probably would have gotten legitimately angry. But it was harder to argue with actual results, unless you were an idiot, and if there was one thing that he didn't feel like being today, it was stupid. He stifled the laugh and slid the potions onto the rack, double and triple checking the label on them, before he and Red swapped sides and checked each other's work against the database of experiments they were running. Months of this work, and they had only started to scratch the surface. This was a lifetime worth of study, 2 lifetimes, 10, 100, years and years stretched out before them of things to learn and problems to eradicate, all bottlenecked by that tiny, golden, glimmering fruit of a very peculiar tree. "Lunch?" he asked his charge. "I'll even stay quiet while you stare at comparison reports based on stir speed." Riveting. Red, alchemist, looked at him with one raised eyebrow as he rolled his shoulder and stretched out the muscles that always seemed more confined than they should be in the clean room suits. Eventually she huffed a breath through her nose. "Yes, lunch," she said. "And then live trials for the last production run, and then filtering, and—" She trailed off as Davis gave her a continuing expectant look. "And then a legally mandated rest period," the woman said bitterly, "where I am required to waste my limited remaining lifespan instead of doing real work. For my well-being." "Oh good, you remembered." Davis turned a short sentence back on her. "I'm thinking pool. We've got a pool table now, finally, and Nate has some weird homebrew beer he's been sharing. And then You can get back to not wasting your life, yes. I suppose I can amuse myself with... Red trailed off as they made their way to the stairwell. Home brewing. It was never time efficient, but now... Davis shook his head. Red had adapted to her new life well, but work-life balance would take a lot more work than ethical behavior for her, it seemed. So that pretty neatly takes us to the question of what are we doing with all the cancer cure potion? James didn't need a schedule to remember that was an important part of the meeting. He glanced over at Reed. Any thoughts? We can make more, Reed admitted. Probably, if the research notes are real and the alchemist helps. What about the stockpile we ended up with? Planner answered the question in a voice that sounded like a dozen scribbling pens. 40,108 doses, they said. Assuming the research logs we have taken custody of were correct, it would be possible to produce an additional 300 doses daily. The ratio of sap usage is relatively low, as is the size of a usable dose. It's human-specific, Reed added. But so far as we know, only humans get lung cancer. Also, it can fix more than lung cancer. It can't heal missing lungs, though, as far as I know. 300 a day is a lot of miracles, Marcus pointed out. I'd vote for that over exercise potions. If you decide not to do more experiments, at least. Same here, JP added. Exercise without the potions is just a matter of time. Cancer without the potions is, also a matter of time, isn't it? He scratched at his arm in a small gesture that James was pretty sure he didn't notice he was doing. But James had known JP a long time, and he remembered his friend losing his father to the thing they now had, as Marcus said, the miracle cure for. Sarah raised a hand in an explosive burst of motion. What about duplicating the potion? Is that more efficient than the porps? Porps? James asked her, concerned. Purple orbs, Sarah said happily. Like how the yellows are scorbs, or the... James started talking before he could hear any other new and terrible words for the office's magic. Yeah, so duplications. He loudly cleared his throat. I've already talked to Anesh about this. We can, in theory, do both. The purple orbs, the ones that cure cancer, don't just get rid of it. They sort of make a person long-term immune. That's an order of magnitude bigger than a one-shot potion, so we don't want to completely transition to potion production, especially because there's other kinds of cancer that aren't lung cancer. But the case that we use for stacking up purples could be waterproof without much effort, and potions keep basically forever if they're stored at room temperature in the dark. So we just alter our duplication case to be a perfectly sized box, and then fill the empty space with a purifier. Put a spout on the side outside of the copy zone or something, I don't know, drain it when it duplicates. He shrugged. Though we can just make a whole thing of lung purifier, but that's not specifically an upgrade. I haven't done the math. I will begin doing the math, Texture of Bark Dust said. It's a 1/4 ounce per dose, Reed commented. How much could you actually fit in the gaps? Reed, this may come as a shock to you, but orbs do not stack well, James said dryly, and almost jumped when the audience he had forgotten was there laughed lightly. So we could probably get, 20 or 30 per copy? Is that right? Texture of Bark Dust swung her neck around to face him. No, she said. James looked at her with raised eyebrows until she clarified. It would be more. Good to know, he told her. But this doesn't actually answer the original question of what do we do with the stock of 40,000 doses. Does anyone have any suggestions? Give it away, Sarah and JP said at the same time. Then, breaking solidarity, they both started talking at the same time, and it got difficult to follow either of them. James raised his hands. Hold up, he said. You're both making the same point, and no one can understand it. We're already giving away the cancer cure orbs. Is there any other idea aside from just adding what we have now of this new solution into the mix? We should change how we do it, Texture of Bark Dust said. How so? Marcus asked before James could. Isn't there a whole team for it? We have 2 official personnel for that project, Planner's pen-scratch voice echoed, and 3 hospitals in agreement that assist. Marcus widened his eyes. That's a lot more than I thought. How many of these do we actually give out? 200 to 300 a week, Texture of Bark Dust offered. Yeah, then we should expand, Marcus said with an assured nod. I can get Harvey in on this. Response actually has a roadmap for future growth, or we could just get James to hire more random people and set them on the problem. Hey! James protested, and was ignored. Off to the side, he caught sight of Sarah being passed another note from one of the filter interns, which she read rapidly before looking up. Hey, here's a suggestion. Why don't we recruit from people who go through the program? She asked. Like, why don't we give jobs to cancer survivors? Marcus asked slowly, looking around at the others at the table. That doesn't sound like a great idea. No, I can see where this is going, JP hummed, holding out a hand toward Marcus. You know who hates cancer? People who've had cancer. I'm not saying we do the James hires randomly thing that keeps inexplicably working. James crossed his arms and huffed at his friend. As long as you acknowledge that it works, he muttered. And that keeps getting us full members of the Order, JP continued. I'm saying we do what Response does, where there are some people who are members of Response and are focused on only its goals. If they eventually switch to something else, it's fine, but they're not here to be knights. They'd be here to help with one thing, for as long as they're working on that thing, and that would be it. It's not like we can't afford to hire more people, Reed said, getting a pair of disagreeing hisses from both Texture of Bark Dust and Planner in different tones. What? He threw up his arms. We're 1 week away from being able to put a hole in the total yearly platinum use on Earth. Don't tell me we're still dealing with money problems. Platinum is not easy to move, Texture of Bark Dust said, not explaining which version of the word move she meant, but probably meaning both. Honestly, if nothing else, we could just do it as a short-term volunteer thing. Just help out for a month or 2, then move on. Enjoy your extra life, James said with a shrug. But I would like to pay them in some way. We'll need to fold Justine and Harvey? Wait, is the other guy's name also Harvey? Did I not notice that? Sarah asked. Whatever, we'll fold them into recovery. Just make it their dedicated job. His name's not Harvey. You think that because that's a professor name, and he looks like a professor. And is a professor. James patted Sarah on the shoulder. I'll let them know tonight. We can get this rolling. Because we've got a lot of extra cure for them to get to distributing. Any strong objections from the audience? JP asked, looking out at the crowd. No one said anything, though there was a small air of excitement over the room. All in favor? He looked back at the stage, raising his own hand before everyone else. James raised his hand too. But he did complain that JP was taking his job as the MC. Joe Haori walked through the halls of a community medical facility near the border of Sierra Leone, secretly wishing that he would at some point take the advice that business suits were not appropriate dress for everywhere he went. It was 32 degrees, and while the air was dry, his forehead was damper than a swamp. Most of the rest of him probably was too, but he decided it would be unprofessional to even think too hard about how much he was sweating. He didn't feel comfortable here. He was an outsider to this country, this community, and this building in particular. So far outside his comfort zone, he wasn't sure if he was still on the same planet. He had lived his whole life in Seoul, grown up there, gone to school there, worked there, worshipped there, nearly died there. 3 months he had been dying. Lung cancer, caught far too late to be easily handled. Surgery had been off the table, so he had started chemotherapy. The worst part wasn't that he was dying. He hadn't been afraid to die at the start. The worst part was feeling himself break. First physically. He was tired more often, and then every day, and then even when he slept. The pain started, and it never stopped. Breathing began to hurt, and then it wasn't just physical, it was mental too. Constant pain kept him from thinking clearly. It made him angry, irritable, unable to control himself. Sometimes the painkillers would work, and for a brief window he would realize how bad it had been. Then it was back to the pain and the exhaustion and the inability. The worst part wasn't when his body broke or his mind, but his soul. Hayori, at the age of 41, had been raised Protestant. He had been one of the pastors at his church for 20 years. He had been faithful, devout. He had believed. His wife and daughter had found renewed faith with his illness. They'd passed the test, as it were. His slow slide into death had pushed them to believe more, to pray harder, to refuse to be broken by the ordeal. He could respect that, somewhat. But for him it had left him feeling empty, hollowed out by the pain, the hunger from not wanting to eat, the exhaustion of not being able to breathe properly. Every other part of him was empty, and in that moment he had realized that his faith was not something that had its own reserve. It had always ever been drawn from the rest of him, and the rest of him had nothing left to give. 3 months ago he'd been dying. 2 months ago he wasn't. A chance meeting with a stranger that was probably no chance at all. A broad wall of a Russian woman who had appeared in his hospital room one night and demanded to know if he wanted to live. Hayori had briefly thought this was God offering him one last out, a temptation that he could prove his belief by refusing. But he did want to live. He didn't know why yet, but he did. So he drank the tiny sip of foul cherry-colored liquid the woman had given him, had a coughing fit that had brought doctors running, and had never seen her again. 2 weeks ago he'd picked up the work where she left off. His coworkers included bizarre alien life and ghosts, and yet his job was familiar. Information management. Processing hospital records, finding people who most needed their help, and, sometimes, when they were short-handed, making a few deliveries. He'd asked how they had all these hospital records, and been told they had a program that stole them. He'd asked if that was secure, safe, or ethical, and been told that was a good question, and the answers were yes, yes, and hopefully. If anyone could steal the records from them, then they could get them easier from the hospitals themselves, the same way that their group was. And now, here he was in Sierra Leone, farther from a big city than he had ever been, melting inside his suit, getting strange looks from everyone he passed. But no one stopped him. No one ever did, for some reason. Hayori found the room he was looking for and entered with a knock. "Good afternoon," he said to the woman inside, before realizing he had spoken in Korean. "Good afternoon," he repeated, switching to Mende, one of the 8 languages he had learned the easy way, through the actual, honest magic that he had been handed in a small, glowing yellow ball. The woman on the bed stared at him with suspicious eyes. "You aren't the doctor," she said accusingly. "No, I am not," Hayori answered with a nod as he set his case down on the foot of the bed, trying not to feel the sympathetic pain of knowing what this poor woman was going through. She was different from him in every way. Different country, different color, different gender, different language, different dress. But she was in a hospital that smelled the same as the one he had lived in before his first false death, and her eyes, tracking him with suspicion and anger, held the same soul-breaking pain that he was so familiar with. She didn't say anything, and so Hayori spoke instead, filling the silence. Words he had practiced easing him out of his anxiety at being somewhere new and into the routine of solving a person's pain. "You have large-cell carcinoma," he said. "Untreatable here. You need to travel to Part Loco to have a chance." "Your accent is terrible," the woman said, turning away from him and staring at the far wall. "Yes, I was given this language, not the experience." He nodded softly. "I could use English if you prefer." Hayori waited, but she didn't answer him, so he moved on. "This will fix your lungs," he said, holding up the small hard plastic vial of liquid he had brought out of his case as the woman whipped her head back to glare at him. She snorted. "Nothing can fix my lungs," she said, with a bitter anger. "I am going to die, but I won't be conned before I go." Hayori smiled. He was pretty sure he'd said something similar. "There's no cost," he told her, setting the vial on the tray next to her bed, careful not to disturb the mostly clean sheets. "No expectation, no con. This is a gift." "A gift of a miracle?" The woman didn't stop glaring at him. "No one gives those gifts. Ever." "We do," Hiyori said, meeting her eyes. The woman made to open her mouth again, but stopped. She looked at him a second time, actually looked at him, like he had learned to look at people, and saw something in his eyes that he knew would never go away. "You may drink it, or keep it, or share it," Hiyori said. "It is a gift. There are no strings attached, but it will cure you." He snapped his case shut. "I apologize for being short, but I must go now. I wish you well." Hiyori turned and walked out of the room, doing his best to ignore the question yelled after him. He was down a hall and around a corner before he heard the woman coughing. Perhaps they'd meet again when his department needed more help, when his time volunteering was up. They were, after all, expanding again next month. "Okay, what's left?" James said. "Planner?" The infomorph gave a vibrating hum. "Discussions of expanding Skulljack use to something common. Following that, I believe we have one good question from the audience to address." A few people filtered out of the crowd. The rough outline for this meeting had been posted, and there were some people who were really just here to keep up on the alchemist stuff, which was fine. James knew they had a tendency to hit tangents a lot, but they should try to make it as easy as possible for everyone to be informed about the things they needed to be informed about. Sarah was practically bouncing in her seat as they moved on. "The Skulljack thing." She tapped the table between them. "Okay, so basically everyone who has one of these things is already doing the thing where they're skipping actually listening to my podcast and just sharing memory files, right?" "I don't think I have to answer that," JP said defiantly. "Yes," James, Marcus, Reed, and Texture of Bark Dust all said in unison, along with a good chunk of people sitting around the stage who weren't actually supposed to be talking. "No," Planner added, "but only because this body does not support it." Sarah's face rippled with purposefully exaggerated consternation. "Well, at least some of you are honest," she said. "Okay, so we've spent the last decade or so, I guess, a while anyway, living with the Skelljacks." "It has been 2 years, tops," JP interjected. "We need to stop being afraid of using them for more things," Sarah said, ignoring him. "Even me, especially me, the memory file sharing thing is actually super cool, and we should lean into that. Make sure it's safe, make it common, make it a part of our little collective culture, even if it's just for skills." Actually, on that note, James raised a hand to ask a question. "Can you share yellow skill orb skills via the Skelljacks? I've been curious about this. I know they transfer over if you form a fully linked mind with somebody, but I don't know if you can just teach someone something specific like that." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah said with a beaming smile. "We should know that." Marcus leaned forward on his elbows with a nervous grimace on his face. Okay, but," he started, and then stopped, not sure quite how to phrase what he was going for. "I don't know how to say this, but safety?" He spread his hands. "Those things are real dangerous, and I've seen how easy they spread. There's a ton of crimes that are going to happen when those get to the general public, you know?" "We do know. We've had this conversation before," Texture of Bark Dust said. "We have been lax in preparing." "Yeah, I actually did hire engineers to start solving the security problem," James said, turning to face Reed. "And then those engineers became delvers, gardeners, and mech designers." Reed leveled a finger at James, despite the embarrassed flush on his face. "Okay, first off, this is what you were talking about. All of you were saying this. James doesn't hire people for one job. James, you hire knights. You asked for the damn mech, too. Do not blame my engineers." "If we budget you funds, will you personally hire normal programmers and normal engineers to solve this problem?" Planner asked. I would rather solve the problem than place blame. James smiled at that. That feels kind of good to hear, he said softly. Yeah, okay, Reed said. I guess I kind of just forgot, with everything going on. I'm on it? Cool. So, as to Sarah's question, well, yeah, it would be super useful if we could save memory files to be downloaded by anyone who wanted to learn something Matrix style. But I actually do have a concern on that, James said. Show of hands, everyone here, even you lot, he addressed the people still in the audience. How many people have gotten a memory recording of Sarah's podcast and felt like it was different? He raised his own hand first, and slowly a lot of other hands and Camerconda affirmative signs went up. Even Sarah's own. Hey, hang on, JP said indignantly, pointing across the table. Yeah, that's the thing, James said with a sigh. Memories aren't just information, it's personal. We can't download a textbook like a yellow orb does. We share our idea of a thing. Maybe that'll be different if we're sharing dungeon skills, and we should try that. But that might make it a bad idea to make this a large-scale thing. Like outside of it being art. Body differences also might complicate, Texture of Bark Dust added. We should test it, though. Oh, absolutely, James said, and more people nodded along. But Marcus isn't wrong. They are a risk, and I'd really like to make sure we can keep from accidentally creating a whole new axis for assault and battery charges. Reed nodded. Like I said, I'll get some people. And I can get us some testing volunteers from response teams, Marcus offered. I mean, yeah, I'm worried about it, but a lot of people still want or have Skelljacks. He shrugged and sighed. May as well make it an official thing, right? Actually, I've been needing to ask, is there anyone abstaining from getting a Skulljack for personal reasons, or because they don't like the idea of connecting to other people or something? James asked. Sarah, I assume you know this. She nodded. I do, and there are. It's a personal choice. Oh, yeah, I agree, James said. I'm just worried about the good old cyberpunk problem of creating a standard you can only reach through augmentation, pushing people to alienate themselves from their own bodies by acquiring that augmentation in order to keep up. He cleared his throat. I mean, I wasn't worried about that, but he held up his phone. At least 4 people have already expressed that they are, in some way, worried about that, and so now I am worried about that. He set the device with the open chat server back on the table, ignoring the exasperated look from the intern, who was about to pass that exact information to him in a minute. But then, don't we run into exactly the same problem as the dungeon stuff? He thought out loud. That the rewards set higher and higher standards as they get focused into people? Yeah, everyone knows about that, Marcus answered blandly. It's kind of hard not to, JP told him. James frowned. I mean, we're trying to do our best to spread it out, he said. But yeah, I know it's a problem, especially as we get more non-Delver members. I mean, that's kind of why everyone's fine with it, Marcus told him. Response teams getting armory packages that keep them safe makes sense, same with Delvers or Rogues or whatever. Basically anyone who's going to be in constant life-threatening danger, which you do put us in all the time. It makes sense to try to, not let them die? He shrugged. So, it's logical, but it does feel kind of bad to think that if I want the fun purple orbs, I have to do the life-threatening thing, he finished. This would be solved in part if we could share skills, Texture of Bark Dust said. Is it a dystopian nightmare if the Skelljacks are free? She asked James. I'll get back to you on that. It would also, the Camerconda continued, allow others to understand us. She said us, and meant her species, the particular frustrations and issues of being a 200-pound, 7-foot-long, half-organic snake in a world built for humans. There was a general agreement among the Camerconda population that they didn't want to have their own culture. They didn't want to be a species separate from the Order of Endless Rooms. They wanted to be here, and they wanted to be this, but that desire and that integration did not make it any easier that they lacked opposable thumbs. Even the 2 rat roaches that were part of the Order now had thumbs. There's non-Skulljack options too, Sarah added. They just take more resources, kinda, like the relation sticks allow for literal actual power sharing, which is really wholesome and stuff. And we can make class copies of sewer textbooks, which lets us spread that around a lot more as well. Planner gave an approving noise, like a rustling sheaf of papers. Yes, the textbooks. My species can use those. It would be interesting to try. Wait, hold on. JP tilted his head. Your species like assignments, or your species like infomorphs in general? Because I'm still waiting for some kind of problem to come up due to how navigators are different from authorities or something. I will seek answers and return them to you, Planner said after a momentary pause. JP held out a hand. To be clear, I also think you should get your own magic. Like, just to make sure no one misquotes me on that. Actually, are infomorphs not already magic? Marcus asked. I kind of assumed. That question Reed answered with a shake of his head. They're magic in the same way your hands are magic. It's impressive that you have thumbs, but if you gave someone else thumbs, he jerked an indicative thumb at texture of bark dust, then they'd know it's a normal type of body. Right, but Planner is a ghost octopus who can eat schedules? Marcus rattled off the pseudo-question. Right? Sorry if this is offensive, Plan. We haven't talked much. You are a mass of primarily carbon who can eat flesh by melting it inside yourself, Planner responded in a dry tone. Marcus looked down at his hands and sort of spaced out as his gaze drifted to the far wall of the warehouse they were in. Okay. Well, I don't have anything to add to that. Sorry. I'm also fine with you getting more magic, and I might skip dinner. Okay, James said, trying to drag this item to a conclusion. Obviously, we need to be looking for more ways to share power equitably across our membership. We can make that a constant thing, and I don't think we really need to vote on it right now. We can start putting together a roster for who's on deck and get a new textbook or whatever else we found, especially since those are small enough to copy sometimes, and one person can't easily use more than one or two anyway. But that said, all in favor of starting to test memory files for the purpose of sharing skills? We can work out the exact issues of body autonomy and security later. I'm just talking about within the order as we are now. The vote this time was more mixed, and there were a few more questions from the audience that they handled about requirements and access, but ultimately, it passed too. Clutter Ascent was growing. James wouldn't exactly say the dungeon was growing up, because he didn't know what the barrier between child and adult even was for a dungeon, or if that analogy worked at all. There might just not be a parallel. What he was sure of was that he had to walk a lot farther to get to the pillow fort this time. The path had become not denser, but more cultivated, the clutter more purposeful, the paths more designed. The narrow trail he followed through the furniture, garden tools, and boxes of ancient crumbling tax forms had gone from being a straight line where he mostly had to worry about tripping on something to a winding maze where dead ends and open clearings threatened to turn him around. There wasn't much maze, really. There was only one clearing and two dead ends that he ran into, and the dead ends had both stopped at cabinets that were clearly placed separate from everything else. He had tried one of them, and found himself once more plunged into sensory deprivation until he could solve the puzzle of what scene he was supposed to imagine. This one was a coffee shop during a cool evening. He opened his eyes to an open cabinet and a single small wooden stick covered in carved markings. When he finally made it to the spot deeper into the dungeon, where the Order's base was, he was a little surprised by how many people had been there, how busy it was. Sarah was reading some kind of book out loud, while a clump of dense fog orbited around her head. Anesh was hanging out, supervising Rufus and Ganesh as the two of them played with a strange chimera creature that had been named Frederick, along with a pair of new life forms that had been made by the Order themselves that looked an awful lot like Pendragon had when she was a baby. A couple of people were sweeping the area, doing some cleanup and basic organization. One of them was the child care specialist James remembered hiring what felt like a century ago, and a few other people just seemed to be relaxing. enjoying the ambiance, playing a card game and talking, and so obviously calm in the middle of a dungeon. James loved this place. He waved at Sarah as he walked in, kissed Nesh on the way by, and stopped by his target toward the back of the open room that was this lamplit collection of blankets and couches. "Hey, Deb," James said to the woman as he approached. She looked up from where she was rearranging a bookshelf. "James," she said, with a small smile, "how are things?" "Oh, good," he said. "Sorry to bother you on your day off, where I can't help but notice you're still working." "It doesn't count," she said with a defiant smile, "because I'm relaxing. Besides, I'm on call." James snorted but didn't contradict her. She was technically right, but they also had expanded their medical staff, and Deb was more or less freed up to do whatever she wanted for a little while, which tended to be continuing to study for her nursing certification exams, which she said were coming up. Apparently she could legally use experience with the Order as hours toward the requirement somehow. James wasn't sure why they qualified, legally, but he suspected either JP or Karen, or both, had a hand or an orb in it. Instead of commenting on that, he just held up the small black rectangle he had brought with him, along with the cable and adapter that just so happened to fit into the port of a skulljack. "Well, you and Anesh were both on the list of volunteers for this, so I figured I could catch you both at the same time," he said. "Want to see if I got it right this time?" "Ah, new memory file?" Deb half asked, perking up. She and James were on much better terms these days, possibly because she had had a long talk with her partner about expectations and personal risk, but also possibly in part because James had stopped taking frequency of sunlight into active war zones. At least, for the last 4 or 5 months, he was absolutely sure that he would be testing their friendship again that way in the future. Or maybe he'd just ask them as a pair and avoid that particular problem. Deb, ignorant of his internal train of thought, continued, "I suppose if we have time, is here a good place?" "It's specifically sword fighting," James said. "Again, still trying to get it right on something mundane before I try making office skill copies, and the program that we grew for this is maybe working." He'd been trying to successfully make a skill shareable via Skulljack for a while. Months by this point. It wasn't literally the only thing he did. James did have a life after all, even if he spent a lot of it delving, or recovering from delving. The problem that the Order was running into when it came to making memory files that could teach something complex was that it actually was complex. You had to put a lot of focus into hitting all the little idiosyncrasies, all the base understanding that would help with the corner cases, and counterintuitively not making the weave of memory too tight. If you didn't leave enough gaps, the human mind would process it once, nod contentedly, and then put it in a box. And that wasn't how people learned things. That was how people crammed for tests when they wouldn't need to know the information 2 days later. You needed the memory you shared to be able to make connections to the rest of the person you handed it to, for them to be able to integrate the experiences and thoughts into themselves naturally, without thinking, without just letting it sit forgotten and unused until it was truly forgotten. Weirdly, it was close to a problem the yellow orbs had. Those didn't ever decay or go stale if left unused. They were always there when you touched on them. But you could forget that you knew how to build a chair from scratch if you didn't build chairs that often. James was one of 8 people who had managed to make bad memory files, and hopefully, if this worked today, he would be one of 3 that was able to make a good memory file, even assisted. He and Deb collected Anesh, and James handed each of them a wooden practice sword, moving out of the pillow fort to the semicircle of open floor in front of it, standing among the dust, dancing in the eternal sunsets coming through 4 different windows from 4 different angles. Both of them took a minute to separately transfer the file from the hard drive to their personal meat substrates, their brains rapidly absorbing the increasingly familiar file type through Skulljack connection. It was, importantly, a different kind of fencing than Anesh already had a skill orb for, but even then, that was part of the test too. Afterward, the two of them faced each other, raising their practice swords, smiling with a familiar expression that James realized looked oddly out of place on his boyfriend's face, and very out of place on Deb's. The two of them moved. Lunge, parry, two strikes deflected off each other, shifting footwork in the same direction, then a strike that would have caught their open flanks if they hadn't dodged at the same moment. The improvised duel sped up as they gained confidence in each other's ability to defend, strikes coming faster and faster. And then it stopped being a matter of just skill, as Deb leveraged her strength and Anesh tried to use his reach. Then James abruptly felt himself slow down as Anesh took a little of his speed. And then, just when Deb seemed like she was getting tired, James felt a tug in his chest and behind his eyes, and she launched back into it, reinvigorated. The wooden practice swords clacked together another 3 times before the one Deb was holding cracked in half, part of it splintering off and tumbling to the floor. Both of them instantly froze as the fight became far less safe and less practice. "Well now," Anesh panted, "that was cool." "It worked," Deb exclaimed. "And also, that was super fucked up." "What, the part where you learned how to fence in 6 seconds?" James asked. "Or the part where it felt like you actually did the things Sarah and I can do and drained sleep out of me through the bond?" He held up his hand, tapping the branded circle on his finger that tethered him to one of his best friends. "No!" Deb turned to face James, leaning forward on her knees and panting, raising the arm with the broken sword to point toward Anesh. "The part where your boyfriend is hot." Anesh turned a deep copper red. "Beg pardon?" he stammered out. "I mean, you are," James said easily. "Yeah," Deb said, "and a lot of your practice doing this comes from him, and now I remember it, except I also have all the times you thought his eyes were cute or whatever whenever you cross guards." She leaned the sword against her leg, and deliberately did not look at Anesh. "It's really weird, and I feel like this is not great." "Well, shit, I'm sorry," James said honestly. "I did not actually mean to do that. I didn't even realize I put that into the file." Anesh dropped his arms to his sides, too. "I didn't even realize..." He trailed off. "I tell you you're cute all the time," James exclaimed. "Well, I thought it was metaphorical," Anesh retorted. "Not literally a distraction when we're sparring." "Okay, I've started to change my mind. This is kind of adorable," Deb said. And then, after a brief pause, her eyes widened. "Wait, did I change my mind, or did you?" She pointed at James. "Hell, I don't know if I like this anymore at all." James sighed dramatically. "Yeah, this is not what I intended. Obviously, emotional bleed is going to be a huge problem. If it's any consolation, you can ogle my boyfriend without reservation, though," he said. And then, before either of them could utter the protests they were obviously working up to, he added, "I'm actually more concerned about how Deb tapped into an attic bond that she does not have." "The only bond I have is with Sarah," Deb said. "For sharing temperature, not sleep. Did you actually feel me take from you? Maybe it was something else." "Try it again," James offered. Deb scrunched up her face and focused before letting out a breath and dropping her shoulders. "No, nothing." Sarah's voice came from the entrance to the blanket fort. "That's my fault," she said. Everyone glanced over at her, and she held up the book that she had been reading. The strange, weird, impossible book that the dungeon had made. That she hadn't really been reading so much as she had been studying, pondering. "I also felt it," she said. "Felt the transfer thing?" James asked. "Yeah, from you to Deb, through me," Sarah added. "Here, try it now." She cracked open the book and looked down at its pages, quickly getting lost in the shifting non-text. James reached out internally and found that he absolutely could. He could feel Deb right there, in addition to Anesh, and he could give or take speed from Anesh, but sleep from Deb, and not just sleep either, but something else too. But it wasn't just them either. "Sarah," he started to ask, "what exactly—" She snapped the book shut with a thump of strange paper. I knew there was something magic about it, she exclaimed. Aside from how it's obviously magic, now I know. When I'm reading it, it expands the reach of my bonds. She pointed at James and then Deb. You and I share sleep, you and I share heat. Deb to me to you. 2 steps, not 1. Then all those people I can feel out there as sources, James slowly said. Wait, hang on. There were like 30 of them. He looked at Sarah with an incredulous stare. She sheepishly tucked the book under her arm, and then held up both of her hands, and let go of the purple orb effect that let her recolor her skin tone. On the back of her hands, the skin was absolutely covered in the circular brands of the addict's relation sticks. Oh, Anesh said slowly. Oh my, I may have just had a thought, he said. Is it that Sarah lets us turn one person into a superhuman through the power of friendship? James asked his boyfriend quietly. Anesh gave a single laborious nod. Yeah, I've now also had that thought. I like this thought, Sarah said optimistically. When did you even open all of those? Deb asked. I make a lot of friends, Sarah answered. Also, how'd the test go? Fine, Anesh and Deb answered instantly at the same time, before looking at each other and then rapidly looking away. Sarah stared at them and then slowly looked over at James. Okay, she said. So that's ominous and also funny. Anyway, want to come have leftover cake and help me read a story to the dungeon and also the new dragons and also a rain cloud and also... Sarah, you can just ask if I want to help you with story time. I could, but my way is a lot more fun, she said. And then, after, you could show me how to make skills, and we can keep making ourselves more and cooler. She grinned at him. And suddenly James realized anyone getting a skill file that Sarah made would probably have a somewhat brighter view of the world. And he didn't know if that excited or scared him. Okay, what's left for today? James said. And hopefully no more big questions. This has kind of run longer than I intended. You always say that, JP said, taking a drink from a glass soda bottle he had manifested on the table, possibly through magic. There was, at this distance, no way for James to know if that soda was completely unique to this reality, and that was a fun feeling. Planner, I'm going to assume you've already scheduled meetings like this every 2 weeks? 3 is expected optimal, Planner responded. Karen and James have suggested a rotating panel of representatives for the time being. Everyone keep appraised of your personal messages. Sarah raised a hand briefly. This actually reminds me that I got summoned for jury duty last week. I keep meaning to bring this up, but what are we? With raised eyebrows and a cheeky tone, James began to answer. The Order of Endless... That's a good question. Marcus was the one who cut him off this time, and James gave an exaggerated pout that he quickly dropped when he realized he was goofing off a bit too much in front of a lot of people who actually did look to him for real-world decisions. Are we a non-profit or a business? We are a people, Texture of Barkdust said simply. As James says, a new society and culture. Okay, that's cool and all, Marcus slowly continued. But there is a government that we're sort of surrounded by. What do they think we are? Terrorists or contractors, probably, JP answered. That got a few concerned words from the audience, and from Marcus. I mean, they can't find us, so it's sort of moot. Some of us actually have apartments, JP, Reed said with a sigh. And this does bring up something else. We cannot just assume we're going to be able to take out anyone that tries to mess with us. We need more security than just hiding and hoping whatever infomorph lives in our head is enough to stop someone from breaking into our houses and taking our stuff. Or lives, or whatever. James sighed. We could reopen communications with the FBI, he offered. An intern rapidly hurried onto stage and started muttering to JP, who then looked up. A lot of people kind of want to know why we stopped talking to the FBI at all, he said. And, again, good question, James. They suck. Good answer. Care to clarify? JP rolled his eyes at his friend. James sighed and turned to face the broader audience, deciding to stand and pace while he covered this particular topic. For those that don't know or are new here, the Bureau representative we had for a while was planning to attempt to kill some of us and steal a lot of our stuff on the grounds that we were out of control and dangerous. He paused, idly cracking the knuckles on one hand. Personally, I have a problem with all of that, starting with the fact that their idea of control isn't working to keep people safe or happy, and continuing on to the murders, and then focusing on the murders. I don't think I can stress this enough, that there were murders planned. He sighed and nodded at the group assembled. The Camercondas generally just took him at his word, but he saw doubt written on the faces of some of the humans. I'm not saying the FBI is universally evil or anything, but they definitely have a lot of problems as an agency if they can't control any of their agents that they send to us, and answering to them is the kind of thing that could twist our organization into something we do not want to be. Though I think we're under a temporary truce right now, he said. From the middle of the audience, Alana's voice rang out. You should probably check on that, she called up to the stage, and a chorus of agreement came with her. James laughed. Yeah, I can do that. In fact, I'll do that after this is done. I am sure someone will take my call, he said. But back to the question of what we are. He turned back to his temporary council on stage. Any suggestions? We're sort of a government, we're sort of a charity, we're sort of an environmental agency, sort of a culture, sort of a lot of other things. What are we to other people, though? I suggest we focus on government, Planner said, perhaps a little predictably. Reed nodded, wrapped within Planner's ghostly arms. Yeah, I can see that. Especially if we plan to start going forward with city building now that we're adapting more and more of the orange totems. The culture aspect is critical too, Sarah said, face unusually serious for the normally exuberant, cheerful girl. Government as a set of rules and organizing principles is great and all for getting stuff done, but if we're going to build and populate a city, we're going to do it with people outside of us, and that means we need to have a culture that can absorb new people and won't break, and can do it fast, and change those people too. Because otherwise we'll pull in thousands of people with the promise of a better life, and they'll turn around and make the same mistakes they were taught were behaviors that made a good society, and they'll ruin the thing that we're working for. This is all fascinating, James said, and yes to both of you, but also this is something we're going to need to get into the details of some other time, because right now I think Sarah's original question was, how do we fit into the world we're part of, or something? And I can't honestly say that right now being a member of the Order of Endless Rooms exempts you from jury duty. Sorry. Sarah snapped her fingers, switching back to her boisterous personality. Heck! She exclaimed. You could look at it as another chance to make friends, JP offered. You do that a lot, right? Getting Sarah to shoot him a look halfway stuck between a suspicious glower and a beaming grin, he smiled back. All right, James waved a hand. We're not going to get anywhere on this. Let's close this part out. Is there anyone here who has a question or concern that hasn't been addressed today? He motioned to the center of the room. Line up, there's a microphone. Or at least there was as he finished saying that, and one of the young interns rapidly set one up in front of the stage. A few people had some questions. More than James had expected, really. But then, he hadn't actually expected more than a few people to be interested in the discussion in the first place, once they got past the immediate crisis. The membership of the Order kept surprising him, but maybe it shouldn't. He made a place where people were rewarded for thinking about things, and then people thought about things. Maybe he should just go with it. A Camerconda approached first, a slimmer camera head and green-black cables in a pattern that James recognized as Scent of Rain. Many of our youngest, the term they were using for the new Camercondas taken from the dungeons, the ones that hadn't been trapped for years in the Tower Colony, having trouble with anger, The Camerconda paused, looking around almost worriedly. They have not learned time, patience. I do not know how to teach them. Sarah started to say something right away, but stopped as she realized she was talking at the same time as Texture of Bark Dust. She made a gesture, ceding the floor to the other Camerconda. Trouble how? Texture of Bark Dust asked. They have not caused damage, no? She sounded on edge, like she'd been surprised by this, and James had to remind himself that the Order was getting larger, and the Camercondas weren't a single clump within it, but spread out across the whole place. They speak without thinking, they lash out, Scent of Rain said. Sometimes try to stop others when not appeased, and I do not know how to teach, except to share what happened to us and tell them that it will not happen to them. Sarah glanced at the Camerconda at the table with them, making sure she wouldn't be interrupting again before getting a nod and starting to talk. It sounds like they're actual kids, which makes sense. Your species grow up a lot faster than ours, but you still had to grow up, and you had a high-pressure condition to do it in. How many new Camercondas are there right now? 13, Texture of Bark Dust answered instantly. That's not that many, Marcus mused. Yeah, even if we're finding 1 or 2 a week, that's less growth than our human population? JP stumbled over the last word and didn't let it slow him down. We've got funding to throw at things. How do we fix this? The same way we fix most behavioral problems, James started to say. Before he could finish, everyone around him, except for a very confused Marcus, echoed the same word with different degrees of enthusiasm. Therapy. You're all fired, James told them, trying not to smile. But, yes, although the problem here is that Camercondas might not react the same to human therapists, especially if they're young. And with a growing population, we can't just keep relying on the 3 or 4 people we have here. Reed cleared his throat. We already have a selection of yellow orbs for a lot of medical stuff. It shouldn't be too hard to devote some time to finding copies for things about mental health. Ones that we can make a lot of copies of and distribute to anyone who wants the job. Okay. All in favor of earmarking resources for that? James asked. Everyone raised their hands this time. Planner, make a note, please, in the meantime. He looked back to Scent of Rain, who looked mildly confused that the response had been that rapid and positive. I'd like to get a kind of after-school program set up around here. We already have a lot of human children at roughly analogous development stages, and it would probably be a good idea to get everyone mixed in together early. But also have some actual guidance, and people they feel safe talking to. Can you stick around afterward? We can start workshopping that? Yes, Scent of Rain bobbed their body. Thank you. Of course, James said instantly. Look, I know that sometimes stuff gets lost in translation or doesn't make it to everyone, but we are here to help everyone, especially people who don't have anywhere else to get help. The Camerconda raised her eye back up and peered at James through its lens. Then thank you more, they said. Oh, don't thank me until you learn how much work it is running a club for teenagers, James told him, hearing a snort from Sarah and JP behind him, who remembered the summer where he had worked at one of those, and complained. A lot. Morgan, Brian, Color of Dawn, and Resplendent Pine Smoke arranged themselves before the greatest enemy the group of 4 teenage and or teenage-adjacent life forms had ever met, prepared to collectively stand unified against the single most difficult conflict that many of them would have faced so far. A responsible adult. No, you absolutely cannot, Elle told them, crossing her arms in their direction. But why not? Brian, their elected spokesman, said calmly. It seems unfair they get them and we don't. The high school senior delivered the line perfectly politely. They had written a script and rehearsed it even, to prepare. Elle refrained from rubbing her forehead, groaning, rolling her eyes, or strangling any of the kids she was nominally in charge of on this bright July day. She, too, had some practice with this sort of thing by now. And months of getting into being a guide for a growing group of miscreants, along with some actual training and some useful yellow orbs, had taught her a lot about the psychology of dealing with kids, And they were still kids, despite the fact that they were kids who were growing up very fast. One of the things she'd learned, and stuck to at all costs, along with everyone else who shared her job, was that you always explained the reason behind things. If you couldn't understand the reason for a rule, you'd better learn it, or you'd better change the rule. Anything else was stupid and unfair, and teenagers would seek out those weaknesses like cracks in the wall of a dam. Because, Elle told them, the Skulljacks aren't toys. She paused and then corrected. Okay, that's not true, but they aren't just toys. They're also kind of incredibly powerful weapons, and handing them to you two seems like a terrible idea. You, who built a catapult a month ago and nearly hit Marcy with a high-speed rock. We did learn from that, though, Resplendent Pine Smoke chimed in, the Camerconda's synthesized voice bright and slightly high-pitched. Did you learn how to build a more accurate catapult, or did you learn not to fire catapults where you might cause unintentional harm? Elle asked. The group looked at each other. Both? Morgan ventured. Okay, well, that's good at least, Elle said. And good job, but also, no Skulljack, because we're trying to make sure those don't spread until we're absolutely ready to make them safe. I don't want any of you accidentally wiping out your own personalities one day, okay? Then how come Color of Dawn and Resplendent Pine Smoke both have them? Brian asked, hitting the next point of debate on the teenager's script. That's not fair to us, that's speciesism. Speciesism? Elle looked at the group of four for a long moment. First of all, speciesism, yes. I feel like James would be disappointed with me from wherever he is if I didn't help with that. Second of all, that's like complaining you don't get a service dog like Neva does. A fix is different than an upgrade, even though, yes, they're also still upgrades. We're working with what we have here. She held up a palm as the kids looked like they were going to launch into more of the debate. Third of all, Elle preempted them, weren't you four making a short film this weekend? Why is this coming up now? We already did all the filming, Color of Dawn said with satisfaction. Yeah, and it's going to be great, Morgan added. Elle narrowed her eyes. You want Skulljack so you can edit video faster, don't you? Final Cut Pro is a bad program and it should feel bad, Brian burst out, abandoning their plan of debate altogether. I'm fine not having one, actually. I'm not the editor, Morgan added. But Brian, he shrugged and threw his friend under the bus. Resplendent Pine Smoke chimed in. We do not share his vision, he said. We are humoring him, even if we are wasting time. Hey! All right, Elle laughed. How about this? We got a whole stockpile of things that grow programs. You tell research I say you can use one or two and figure out how you'd upgrade a video editing program, and in exchange, please hold off on getting the brain hole, okay? She wrapped an arm around Brian's shoulders. You will have plenty of time to modify your body when we find safe and less contagious methods, all right? He tried to shrug her off, but not that hard. Fine, the teenager said. Good. Elle took his agreement at face value. Also, don't think I don't appreciate the hell out of you guys for showing restraint and actually asking instead of just passing a skulljack to each other without telling anybody. That kind of honesty, good shit. Elle paused. Or stuff, or something. Oh, whatever, you probably all swear more than I do. She sighed. Look, the other groups are going to be done with their independent activities in about 20 minutes. How about you guys pick what the group thing is today? Dodgeball, Resplendent Pine Smoke barked out instantly. You don't even have arms today, Morgan protested. The Camerconda reared up regally, irising the lens of his camera eye. I will stop us being struck. You will use your arms, he said, dividing labor proudly. Elle grinned and shook her head as the four teens ran and slithered off, arguing amongst each other like only actual friends really could. Then she caught herself and snorted. Man, why did I let James trick me into being a mom? She muttered. You're not bad at it, Jean said with a calm smile, the actual mom overhearing Elle as she passed by. Her own summer activity group spilled around her through the front door of the lair. I'm not sure how I got tricked into this either, though. Oh, you're easy, Elle said. Your kid loves it here and they offered you a lot of money. Hey! Jean put a hand over her chest, adopting an offended look. That would only work for a very long time before I'd catch on. A Camerconda voice joined them. It works on many people, it seems, Scent of Rain added. And I am informed we are letting the children throw things, she asked. The women shared a laugh before Elle shook her head. I let my group pick the team thing today as positive reinforcement, she explained. Resplendent's getting a lot better about not freezing people who he thinks he's better than, so that's good. The new ones learn, Scent of Rain said. It is... We were afraid. We were afraid that they were broken and that they knew it. This is better. Being honest, being not afraid. They make mistakes, but they learn and we grow. Mine too. Me too. I think I'm even learning how to raise my own daughter better, Jean said with a sigh. Did you ever think... any of this? She asked. No, Elle said, rolling her eyes. Okay, well, yes, but also no. But also whatever, right? She shrugged, not bothering to hide how easy the movement was or how content she felt in the moment. So weird here. So weird. Anything could change at any time. There's no way to expect what's next, so I'm not going to try. I'm just going to do my best and have some fun. She paused. And I'm also going to exploit the fact that people in research think I'm allowed to ask for things now. Is that why there's a mural in one of the basements that changes depending on what part you're looking at? Jean asked with a curious grin. Look, the months get long when no one's trying to kill me, Elle said, as the three of them headed off to the equipment closet to get the dodgeball stuff. They ran through a few more questions, a lot of them operational in nature. It had been a while since James had actually updated the operations manual, and he hadn't really realized no one else was doing it, which was a big problem. They sorted out some actual responsibilities for maintaining the growing database, which led into a question about how people were getting paid, and a conversation on the different methods of membership within the Order. Some people were here as a job, technically. Some people were here because they had nowhere else to go. Some people were a little bit of both. But everyone still, as had been pointed out earlier, lived inside a country that required money to purchase goods or services. The Order wasn't planning to leave anyone behind, or trap anyone in their ranks by not paying them enough to leave if they wanted to. James outlined the basic idea to everyone of paying a base rate to anyone that was on the roster, and then adding more based on responsibilities taken on. Planner and Texture of Bark Dust had both sighed, which was interesting given their respective species, and began discussing specific numbers. Apparently, Karen had been working on something like this already. The important part was, while it was detailed, it wasn't overly complicated. There was adamant agreement from everyone that all systems they built be easy enough to learn and understand. This led to another concern from one of the attic's caretakers, that research members were being unfairly overpaid because of the number of extra orbs they ended up with in the natural course of doing their jobs. That was an interesting half-hour-long diversion, where Reed tried to figure out exactly how many magic pens they had broken in the last year. But ultimately, it came down to the problem that they didn't really know how to put a price tag on the magic stuff. A single blue orb could be worth the cost of auditing a college course for 3 months, or it could be worth everything you had ever owned twice over. There wasn't a clear decision on what to do about it, but Texture of Bark Dust promised that a couple people from Recovery would start looking into ensuring equity in terms of how orbs got distributed. It got folded into the project for better distribution of magic in general. Someone from Response had a question about whether or not they were even allowed into dungeons, which James almost answered instantly, before Marcus made it more complicated by bringing up the fact that the two places required different sets of instincts. Response teams needed to be non-violent in almost every situation, while dungeon teams needed to be prepared to fight for their lives at a moment's notice, and training something to switch that on and off was a challenge at best and stupid at worst. When it was laid out that way, James realized it was actually maybe not common among members of the Order that somebody be willing to put their life on the line just to have an adventure. Which was exactly what the last question of the evening was about, too. "My husband," the woman at the microphone said, "wants to go into one of those dungeons." She had a rather unhappy look on her face, and James only vaguely recognized her from a couple of sightings around the lair. "I'm sorry, I don't... Who is your husband?" he asked. "Mark," the woman said. "Mark Diaz. I'm his wife, Marcy." "Right," James nodded. "He's scheduled for the next group to go into Winter's Climb, which I am guessing, by the glare that is threatening to melt my lapel mic off, you do not approve of." The woman turned the glare down, perhaps realizing how hostile she looked. "People talk about them," she said, "like they kill people." "They could," Texture of Bark Dust said. "Marcus was right. You must be prepared to fight to enter one." "Well, then take him off the list. He isn't allowed," Marcy stated. Two thoughts crossed James's mind. One was that, in retrospect, it was kind of impressive that no one had died in a dungeon since the Order had really started delving them professionally. Secondary to that, he hoped that thinking that thought didn't curse them. But also, he was thinking that there was no way in hell he was going to get involved in another one of these kind of relationship crossfires. He cleared his throat and tried to speak evenly. "Marcy, I'm not going to do that," he said, and before she could say something angry to him, continued quickly. "Your husband gets to make his own choices, and I could tell you that we're going in as well equipped as we can, that we'll play safe, that we're not planning on taking stupid risks, and all of that is true. But you're right, it is dangerous. I could tell you I don't care who goes, but I really, really do. Mark and Bill actually had a similar argument to this, loudly, in the lobby a couple of days ago. Bill lost, by the way." James sighed, before continuing. "I don't want anyone to die and leave someone behind. That sucks. But a lot of people want to be able to do more. To be more. To go beyond what baseline humanity offers. And all I can do about that is make them as ready as possible and promise that if they die, their families get taken care of." "Or we can try to bring them back to life," Sarah added. James rubbed at his forehead. "Yes, or that. Thank you, Sarah." She shot him a thumbs up, grinning broadly. "But you're still willing to let him risk death?" Marcy demanded. "I hadn't really thought about it in that specific way before, but yes," James said. "Also, I'm entirely uncomfortable being the arbiter in someone else's relationship. You should talk to your husband, not to me. I do think we need more discussion about how people with families, surrogate or otherwise, risk their lives. But for this in particular, a more private conversation might be appropriate." He sighed again. "If you want to talk tomorrow or the next day, I'm available. So's Momo, who's in charge of the climb scheduling right now. You okay talking then?" Marcy looked like she wanted to disagree, but James was disarmingly honest about the whole thing, and so instead she just nodded. "I'm sure we can find a compromise." She stressed the last word, like she knew exactly what kind of compromise her husband would be finding. She didn't. James's boots crunched into powdery snow as he sunk 2 feet despite the snowshoes. The transition into Winter's Climb was still jarring, but at least it didn't cause the nausea and headache that the sewer still did. It did catch him off guard when a fist-sized chunk of ice shattered on his armor's shoulder plate, almost sending him tumbling backward. A hand that was already thick before 2 layers of gloves went over it caught him and pushed him back upright against the howling wind. "Fuck, man!" the barrel-chested man bellowed. "It was way too cold outside, now it's hailing bullets in here. Australia sucks." James laughed into his face mask as he in a rush unclipped the broad shields on their back, strapped them onto their arms, and raised them in the direction of the storm, beginning to push ahead. Hailstones occasionally slammed into their guard as the 4 other members of the expedition kept low profiles behind them. "It's August, dear," James heard Marcy say to her husband behind him, loud enough to be heard over the wind. "Australia is colder in August." "Well, what about in here?" Mark asked his wife back in a loud yell as the two of them adjusted the weight of their delve gear on the backs and followed after James. Marcy glanced behind them. Through a gap in the storm wall, she saw howling, empty air over an impossible cliff edge. Beyond that, maybe a mile, maybe 100 miles away, a row of peaks rose like teeth into the sky. She could have sworn, for just a second, she saw a glimpse of another mountain above, towering downward from the sky itself to meet its grounded brothers. "In here isn't Australia," she called back. "Now keep walking." James laughed at the married couple and took the advice himself, pushing forward. Upward. "All right," James finished the meeting, dusting off his hands. "That's enough problems for us to solve over the next, I don't know, week or two at most, probably. I'll see you all again after I've had a really long nap. Maybe a shower." He smiled at the audience, folding his hands behind his back. "Thank you all for coming. Actually, I don't know how to say this. I don't know the words, but this matters. All of us talking about how to progress, it matters. And the more we do this, the better we can make whatever world we end up with." Behind him, Sarah slid out of her chair and leapt forward to wrap her arms around his shoulders, hanging off of him in a dramatic fashion. "Also, it's fun to actually be able to fix things," she added. "Also that, yes," James said, doing his best to not sag under her weight. "Also, you agreed to do 2 more things after this meeting, during this meeting," Planner added, as Reed stood and walked toward the edge of the stage himself. "Also that, yes, thanks," James grumbled. "So, nap delayed. Meeting's over. Everyone go home." He laughed. "I'll see you all later, I'm sure." He was still laughing to himself as he walked out of the room, joined by Alana, his partner jostling with Sarah for real estate on his back, and as he looked around the bustling first floor of the lair, where people of multiple species, from multiple lives and backgrounds, congregated between jobs to talk, relax, and share their time, he smiled to himself. James rubbed his hands together. There was always more to do. The reward for a job well done was, in the end, more job. But these days he didn't feel bad about that at all. Things were never going to calm down. Not really. But did they need to? If he couldn't handle it, he had all these friends and allies to help shoulder the work. They were, at the end of the day, all in this together, and they had a lot to do. Time to get to work. End Book 3.